Welcome, everybody, to episode 56 of Generation Jihad. I'm Tom Jocelyn, and I'm joined, as always, by my colleague, Bill Roggio. Bill.
Hello, everyone.
We are senior fellows at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and have been running FDD's Long War Journal for a long time now. And America's role in the war in Afghanistan has come to an end. And guess what? The Jihad hasn't come to an end, and there's plenty to talk about. This is an ongoing story, obviously. So even though we spend a lot of time on Afghanistan in this podcast, there's still quite a bit to discuss, right, Bill?
Yeah, this war has not ended. This was a loss. There's no better way to put it. There's no other way to put it. And it needs to be digested and understood how this happened. 20 years after 9/11, we lost to the group that sponsored Al-Qaeda to conduct a terrorist attack on the United States.
Yeah, well, let's start right there before we jump into it with other issues. Let's start right there with that issue because, of course, one of the things that you and I have talked about a lot and written about a lot is Taliban apologia and how it infected Americans' understanding of all this. And there's just so much nonsense out there, even in recent days, about the Taliban. All sorts of attempts to make exculpatory arguments on behalf of the Taliban and blame America and the Bush administration and this and that for the war in Afghanistan. Now, look, there's a lot to criticize. I can critique everything right from day one in the war in Afghanistan. So can you. And we have plenty of criticisms. If you can listen to episode 55, for example, there's plenty of criticisms to walk through of America's conduct of this war. But the apology on behalf of the Taliban is a bit much. It's a lot. It's actually way too much. And I just want to start off, Bill, by talking about one thing here. You know, it's telling that just days after the Taliban took over Afghanistan. Now, of course, when they take over Afghanistan, they what? They control the media. They control now the schools. They control the entire infrastructure. Well, let's start with the media. They control Afghan television now. And you've seen images of the Taliban's goons standing behind journalists on Tolo News and other programs in Afghanistan. But they also now control RTA Afghanistan, or RTA, Radio Television Afghanistan, I think it is. And they used RTA to put out the latest edition of their Victorious Force series. This is a series you and I have written about. This is the third installment in the Victorious Force series. And as everybody would expect, they gloat over their victory in Afghanistan. They celebrate their suicide squads. And they do something else. They rub our noses in 9/11 because they have multiple images, both of the real footage from 9/11 and reenactments. And as they play this on screen, they blame America for the 9/11 attacks. They blame American policy, which, by the way, was Mullah Omar's talking point 20 years ago and has been the Taliban's talking point every year since then. And so they go on television in Afghanistan, throughout Afghanistan. And I don't know how many homes this was broadcast into in Afghanistan these days. Excuse me. I do know that it received at minimum tens of thousands of views online, probably maybe more than that. And they don't blame Al-Qaeda for 9/11. They don't say, hey, we're sorry about 9/11, it won't happen again. They don't accept responsibility for harboring bin Laden and refusing to turn him over more than 30 times, by the way. No, they don't even mention Al-Qaeda's culpability responsibility. Instead, they play this game where they pretend that it was just a result of America's errant policies or aggressive foreign policies that 9/11 happened. Now, there's a certain contingent for that market, even in the U.S. establishment. We know there are people who trade in that sort of blame America first thinking, for sure. But for anybody who's sane and rational, you know that that's garbage, right? And what I was struck by, Bill, watching this video was the disconnect between what the Taliban is saying on national television in Afghanistan and what our so-called elites are saying in Washington. The so-called elites in Washington are talking about how they're going to hold the Taliban to its counterterrorism commitments. These are the flimsy commitments in the so-called flimsy commitments flimsy and so-called commitments in the Doha deal that was signed between the Trump administration and the Taliban in Doha in February 2020. At a time when Secretary of State Anthony Blinken is talking about their counterterrorism commitments, and the Defense Department is talking about partnering with them against ISIS, and you hear other people prattling along the same lines. The Taliban is rubbing our noses in it on 9/11 about 9/11 on national TV. That's what they're doing, and they're saying that America and Americans deserve to get attacked. When we talk about the failures in Afghanistan, Bill, I think that this is one way to explore those failures. It's probably the most important way to explore those failures, because how do you get to a point where America's so-called elite, their leaders, are making excuses for the Taliban and pretending that it's our counterterrorism partner while they're literally gloating about 9/11 on national television.
Yeah, Tom, it's a process that began over a decade ago. Once we, once our so-called elites, as you said, and rightfully so, have accepted the idea that the Taliban actually weren't our enemy and they were a group that could be negotiated with. I remember this even started with the way back in the way with General Flynn, and there was an English general. I can't remember his name at the moment, but they were saying things like, "Well, the Haqqanis really aren't part of the Taliban, and they're pragmatic." This was like 2009, Tom, if I recall. This is when you started seeing the floodgates open for this within, not just the elites in Washington, but military leaders starting to state this. And once you went down that road, once the Taliban weren't our enemy, once you decided to disconnect the dots, as you love to say, and rightfully so, Tom, I use so many of your phraseologies in this, when talking to others. Once you start going down that road, then this is how ideas like this become cemented. This is how you can have, as the Taliban's broadcasting their suicide bombers and rubbing it in our noses that 9/11 was our fault and we deserved it. Remember, they issued a video a couple of years back saying we deserved 9/11. We got what we deserved. This was
that was in 2000. It was July 2019. You and I wrote it up, and that was in the middle of the talks of the Trump administration and Taliban. And it didn't. It just those talks went on without a skip.
Yeah.
No
one mentioned it.
Didn't miss a beat. Didn't skip a beat. Everybody just sort of kept going. Oh, Taliban is giving us counterterrorism assurances. Okay, great guy. Great
While
job, guys.
So once that process began, it was over. That's how we knew the war in Afghanistan was lost. Certainly by what, Tom, we probably knew this by 2013, 14. We knew the surge would fail. Those are tactical and reasons, but we knew that once our policymakers, our so-called betters, viewed the Taliban as, and even what General McKenzie said recently, he called them our Afghan partners. Once you go down that road, it was lost. And this outcome was bound to happen, to have a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you said, Bill, when you get into this, the details of this, the truth of the matter is that this was a foundational reason this war was lost. There are many reasons why the war was lost, many reasons why this debacle unfolded the way it did. And I think some of those reasons are well understood, others are not. This is one of those foundational reasons that's not understood. Is that the truth of the matter is that for much of the 20 years, America pretended like the Taliban wasn't really its enemy. How do you fight in a war against the other side when you have many people saying, well, they're not really our enemy, we don't really want to fight them? I mean, in the history of warfare, have many wars been won that way? I don't think so. And yet, for certainly the last decade of this war, that was the dominant thinking in policymaking circles. And this disconnect the dots mentality really had permeated. But, again, I think that, look, you and I can muster an encyclopedia worth of facts to show how this thinking was erroneous and really flawed, and in some ways even sick, I would say, because I think when I go through this, I see all this revisionism and apology online. I have people tweeting stuff at me. I see it in articles, and it's clear that people want to believe that the Taliban was going to settle for something other than the restoration of its Islamic Emirate. They want to believe that. They want to believe that America was at fault for this war in the first place. Meanwhile, the Taliban is rubbing our noses at 9/11. So, there's a lot of ways we can rebut that Taliban revisionism and apologia, but I think that video is a great starting point. But here, let's talk about this a little bit further too. One other quick thing on that. The degree to which this revisionism sunk in, it absolutely shaped, I would say, even warped policy. Bill, you and I have been looking at the comments let's look at the comments just even done, again, I mentioned Secretary of State Anthony Blinken's comments. He's got a whole graveyard of wrong-headed assertions this year. You can go through them, one tombstone after another, of things he said that just didn't pan out and don't make any sense. But he's not the only one. There turns out there's a whole graveyard of nonsense comments that have been made by America's leaders, so-called leaders. You take the last two defense secretaries for President Trump. I was just looking at this recently. So you remember he had Secretary of Defense Mark Esper. He gets fired in November of last year, I think it was, after the election, in part because he disagreed with the way that Trump was pushing to withdraw completely by Christmas, I think it was. This is part of the Trumpkins now. They'll say, well, it was a conditions-based withdrawal. They didn't really want to get fully out. No, he wasn't. President Trump was pushing for a complete withdrawal. And that's his prerogative. He should have completed it earlier, I would say, and own it, but don't tell me now that it was conditions-based withdrawal, because it wasn't. But anyway, Esper disagrees with that. But and there's a lot of what Esper's been saying that it's true. He's right that the Taliban didn't live up to any of its counterterrorism commitments, didn't live up to its end of the deal when it came to talks with the Afghan government, which was looking to depose. But part of what Esper says is wrong. Like in terms, it shows you how this revisionism had sunk in. He wanted to keep an ongoing presence in Afghanistan because he and others imagined that it was going to affect some sort of political solution, political settlement between the Taliban and the Afghan government. No, folks, no. There's no evidence for that, right? They were fighting to win all along. This is how delusional American policy became. But you only get to that point if you have a warped view of the Taliban in mind, right, Bill?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we could talk about a lot of problems that, of why this war was lost, why, how we built the Afghan government, how we built the Afghan military, strategy, counter, rural versus population centered. Those were fixable problems. Those were problems that could have been corrected over time. There were tactical problems in how we were operationalizing strategy, but the strategy itself was wrong. And for what you had just said, we can negotiate with the Taliban. Just flat out wrong. If you operate on that principle, you're destined to lose. The Taliban will negotiate in good faith and will share power. Absolutely. When you have those beliefs, that is factored into your decision making and into your strategy, you're destined to lose. This is where, look, I have a lot of criticism of the Bush administration handling of Afghanistan, but those were problems. It never came from the point of, or from the place of, let's negotiate with the Taliban, let's surrender to the Taliban. The Taliban are our friends. It didn't come from that. Those problems, we could have, in 2010, in 2015, you could have reorganized the Afghan military if someone would have recognized it. No one wanted to recognize it. And the reason they didn't want to deal with these issues like that is because they believed that there was a political solution at the end of the tunnel. So why bother reorganizing the Afghan military if at the end of the day, that's assuming they even recognized that there was a problem, which I don't think they really did. But why bothering fixing those problems if you think at the end of the day you're just going to get a solution with the Taliban?
Yeah, I would say that this is why the counterfactuals and all this are so difficult, because the problem is that I can't fix these foundational problems. Certainly, we couldn't fix them at the time, even though we were arguing against it, right? I mean, we were arguing against this is not hindsight is 2020. We were saying this at the time. We've been saying this for the last 12 years. Just nobody wanted to base their policy in reality. So if you're saying it at the time and there's plenty of evidence at the time and people our leaders are unwilling to fix it, well, there's nothing we can do. And so that's why these counterfactuals are almost impossible, I would say. In fact, my joke about counterfactuals on Afghanistan now and how the war could have gone different is, and I've probably used this before on the podcast, but I'll use it again. These types of counterfactuals are the equivalent of saying, if I was a horse with a horn and wings, I'd be a unicorn. Right. I mean, well, look, folks, I'm not a unicorn, but that's basically what the level of the counterfactual. That's how screwed up the war in Afghanistan is. You have to entertain this massive leap to try and figure out how to make it go better than it did. Let's say, I don't even think win, just make it something that's salvageable.
Tom, real quick, the argument to stay in Afghanistan, just to stay in Afghanistan, if we had just kept those troops in Afghanistan, this wouldn't have happened. Well, maybe it wouldn't happen like this, but as long as our strategy was wrong, as long as we were waiting for that settlement, we were destined to fail. The Taliban was taking over territory. And so it's just very frustrating to hear it. And then all of the arguments are political. It's Trump. It's Biden. It was this. It was that. They could all be this ridiculous binary thinking. It's all of them, particularly the last three administrations whose primary goal for Afghanistan was to leave Afghanistan. Once that's your goal, everybody is looking at the exit, and no one's really cares about success because the success wasn't the goal in Afghanistan. Leaving was the goal, and that's a huge part of the failure as well. That's why the military did things half-assed. That's why State Department looked for diplomatic solutions. That's why military leaders like Nicholson and General Miller were leaning on negotiated solutions, because they realized that we were leaving And they said stupid things like there's no military solution for Afghanistan. Tell that to the Taliban. Their military solution looked pretty final, if you ask me.
Yeah, I mean, look, we got a lot to criticize within the U.S. military leadership. Part of it is that nobody stood up to say this is insane, right? That, I mean, if maybe they didn't understand it was insane, maybe they were lying themselves, maybe they were lying to us, maybe a combination of all those things. But yeah, if you're operating within erratic political leadership that just wants out of a war, if I were a general, I'd say, hey, listen to the commander in chief. You want out? Well, then let's get out. Don't tell me that I have to. I'm not going to stay in some sort of compromised, ambivalent state here. If the decision is that we're out, then we're out, right? Then don't make me try and compromise here, because either we fight to win or we leave, right? And the point is that we spent more. The U.S. spent definitely most of the war, most of the 20 years, not fighting to win. That's for sure. And so there are a lot of people who say, well, you couldn't win anyway. Well, again, counterfactuals are difficult, especially in something as messy as this. But all I know is that for all those people that advocated a negotiated settlement with the Taliban, where's your comeuppance, right? The truth of the matter is that the American government pursued your policy line for much of the war. The U.S. negotiated with the Taliban at length 2 different times over the period of 10 years. The first time ended with a debacle in Doha where they rubbed our noses in it and flew the flag of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. And even the Obama administration walked away from those talks because it was clear they were not serious about peace. The second time ended with the Taliban taking over the country. So don't tell me that your diplomatic path was better than the military path, because your diplomatic path actually compromised the military path. And the two of them acted in a symbiotic sort of way to lead to a total victory for the jihadists. Because guess what? They had better military strategists than our side, and they had better diplomats than our side. And isn't that pathetic? So before we move on to what's going on in Afghanistan now, I just want to give one other comment here. So I just mentioned the last 2 defense secretaries for Trump. I mentioned Esper's comments. Chris Miller, who was the acting defense secretary, who doesn't really know anything about Al-Qaeda, and even over a period of several months, he has a graveyard of inaccurate statements about Al-Qaeda, which is quite impressive, really, for a guy who was the head of the National Counterterrorism Center. Miller, he had a whole idea. He was talking to Defense One, I think it was. He did an interview where he was talking about his whole plan, or his whole understanding was the Taliban was going to allow America to keep counterterrorism forces in country to do counterterrorism missions, right? I mean, boy, oh boy, how clueless is that? First of all, it's operating on the assumption the Taliban isn't in bed with Al-Qaeda, which it is, right? So you're wrong about that. And then it's operating on the assumption that the Taliban is willing to allow America to maintain some sort of presence in Afghanistan, which it never was, right? And then it shows you this sort of myopia where it comes to ISIS, where it all became ISIS for these guys. That's all they could see. Now, ISIS is a threat. It's a problem. But, this idea that you were going to work with the Taliban against ISIS while ignoring the elephant in the room, meaning Al-Qaeda, really tells you a lot about how feckless America's leadership is. But that was so these are the last 2 defense secretaries for this war under the Trump administration, before Lloyd Austin comes in for the Biden administration, really had no understanding of even what they were looking at. And they had bought into this idea of a negotiated settlement with the Taliban, and even thought the Taliban was going to be our counterterrorism partner, which of course is insane.
Yeah, Tom, I summed that up with the Taliban will fight ISIS, or even as Secretary Pompeo said, the Taliban will work with us to destroy Al-Qaeda, right? Let's partner with terrorists who use suicide bombers, that's the Taliban, to protect the United States and its citizens from other terrorists who use suicide bombers, Islamic State or Al-Qaeda. I mean, it's absolutely insane. Why we would think that this would work, that this is a good idea, is beyond me. But it just goes to show how desperate these people were and how little they understood the nature of the enemy. We saw this one coming from miles and miles away, from light years away. We saw this coming, and everyone pursued this path of insanity. And this is how you get a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan with its ally Al-Qaeda showing its hand once again. It's always been there. Now they're coming out in the open. Dr. Amin al-Haq, who was Al-Qaeda's security chief in Tora Bora and prior, he's escorted by the Taliban in a military convoy in a celebratory return to his home in Nangarhar province. What does that mean? I don't think you need to be a rocket science, but something tells me that the Taliban wasn't working with the U.S. to destroy Al-Qaeda in that particular instance. And in fact, just the opposite.
Yeah, it was all nonsense. I mean, the truth of the matter is the Taliban suicide bombers are often Al Qaeda suicide
Yes.
bombers,
Yes.
because Al Qaeda's trainers and mentors are all embedded. You can see this in a variety of places, all embedded to train them. And there's all sorts of evidence that the special forces for the Taliban, which utilizes suicide bombers, has quite a heavy Al Qaeda hand within it. But before moving on to the aftermath here, which I really want to get to in 1 second, um, look, all the apologists for the Taliban, all the revisionism for the Taliban, the thing that's really perverse about this is they've gotten their wish, really. They've gotten the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan has come back into power. And these people are going to continue uninterrupted. They can go from advocates for the Taliban or de facto advocates for the Taliban to basically lobbyists for the new Islamic Emirate. And this is how sick all this is. I would rather just have the U.S. disengage than continue to engage on a pro-Taliban policy, which has really affected things throughout much of the war, and is now going to dominate, I would say, the aftermath, which is really, I think, perverse. But let's move on to the aftermath here. So you mentioned the Haqqanis earlier, Bill. One of the things that is striking to you and me, we watched this online, is how much the Taliban is advertising not just Mullah Omar, its founder, as the ultimate victor in the war in Afghanistan, but also Jalaluddin Haqqani. And you can see, I noticed this, that Taliban very quickly had billboards to put up all throughout Afghanistan, didn't they? They're professional quality, with high resolution images, and they're in Kabul and they're elsewhere. And some of these billboards, of course, advertised Jalaluddin Haqqani, who was one of bin Laden's first benefactor, certainly his first benefactor in the region. We've written up some Haqqani related stories recently. We've written up the Haqqanis many times over the last 12 plus years. And I have 2 Haqqani related stories coming in coming days on Long War Journal. But to me, this strikes, you were talking about how, there was this idea in the U.S. military and the U.S. government about a decade ago, or a little more than a decade ago, that the Haqqanis were reconcilable, that they were something other than an integral part of the Taliban and something other than Al Qaeda's closest ally. This again speaks to the fundamental problems here, right? This is ignorance, just sheer ignorance. The U.S. didn't understand who the Haqqanis really are, or how they fit into all this. And it took years for the U.S. I think it was sometime, there was a debate even in 2011, 2012, sometime around that time frame, about 10 years ago, about even designating them as a foreign terrorist organization. Remember, there was actually an elaborate sort of debate in Washington over whether or not they should do that, right? And it's like, holy cow, you're 10 years into the war and you still don't know who the Haqqanis are, or whether or not they're a terrorist organization, or whether or not they're either basically a core part of what Al Qaeda is doing in the region. I mean, wow. It just speaks to the fundamental ignorance here. But the fact that the Taliban is now celebrating openly Jalaluddin Haqqani on these billboards and elsewhere and all throughout social media speaks to the magnitude of this ignorance on the American side, right? Because it shows you that they consider him to be this ultimate victor in this war.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've had State Department spokesman Ned Price comes out the other week and says the Haqqanis and the Taliban are separate. They're not the same. And then yesterday, the Taliban look, we've documented this for years. The Taliban themselves, the Haqqanis, the Taliban, they all say this is nonsense. And then you have the Taliban spokesman come out and say this again. Ned Price is either ignorant, and when I say ignorant, I'm saying it in the sense of he doesn't know, or he's actively lying. Neither are good, folks. I don't know what to tell you. Like, if he doesn't understand the Taliban-Haqqani relationship and that they are one in the same, then he shouldn't talk about it. But if he knows it, he's lying to the American public. I suspect he's ignorant, and this is just what the Taliban apologists and the people that need to, push these types of ideas to in order to separate the Taliban-Haqqani relationship, because these are people that want to work with the Taliban. But let's face it, folks, the Haqqanis aren't the only part of the Taliban that are closely allied with Al Qaeda. It's just the easiest one to identify. It's just the simplest one, because just about every Haqqani leader who's been designated has been directly pointed to ties to Al Qaeda. But Tom and I could name several others who are been designated within the Taliban, who are senior leaders and who are not Haqqanis and who have close ties to Al Qaeda. So it's this kind of nonsense that persists, that just it's completely maddening, and we know why it's being done. It's being done. This type of apology is put out there to justify negotiating with the Taliban, working with them, calling them our Afghan partners, because American officials know that they abandoned Americans in Afghanistan. Hundreds of Americans who want, at least, who want to leave Afghanistan and who are essentially hostage to the Taliban right now. And so this is why these types of things are said. And it's also the decade plus of apologia for the Taliban. It's absolutely maddening. Um, it, I would hope that one day someone would investigate the Congress, some would investigate this, but everyone's just too busy with finger pointing and making political issues out of this. So the reality is all of this will just be mired in ignorance for the next several decades.
Yeah, I mean, again, I always say I hope none of this matters to Americans ever again, because watching the first run of this story was painful, and documenting it, was just absurd. But yeah, the Connies are the easiest part to point to, both being an integral part of the Taliban and being Al Qaeda's closest ally in the region. And yet they're still mangling it in 2021. They're still either, as you said, lying or don't know it. And, Pentagon spokesman Kirby, just recently said too as well. And John Kirby came out and said, well, there's a certain amount of commingling there. I think it's the phrase he used. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. There's a certain amount of commingling, Kirby. Got it. Commingling, Sergio Nakhani has literally been the deputy emir of the Taliban's Islamic Emirate since 2015. He's now the interior minister in the new regime, which gives him vast power across the governance structure of the Taliban's new authoritarian regime. Yeah, I could call that some commingling, but you can go through all sorts of other points here where commingling, of course, absolutely downplays the extent of what happened here. And the truth of the matter is, that this all speaks to the fundamental ignorance in all this, and it's just ridiculous, just totally ridiculous. So let's talk about a little bit more about the Haqqanis, however. So I just mentioned Siraj Haqqani. The Taliban put out a statement. I'm writing this up from Long War Journal. I think it was Secretary of Defense Austin or somebody else recently commented in Washington that, Sergio Nakhani, who's the interior minister, deputy emir for the Taliban's Islamic Emirate since 2015, was basically, a counterterrorism concern or a counterterrorism target. And the Taliban did something very interesting. They used the Doha Agreement against America, the servile agreement that the Trump administration entered into with the Taliban. The Taliban comes out and cites the agreement and says, no. You can't attack Siraj Haqqani, and you can't do anything to counter his threat or the fact that he's, here and doing his terrorist thing, because you signed this agreement saying you wouldn't do that. And this is part of what you and I were warning about. I pointed to the fact that Section 1F of that agreement said the U.S. is never going to attack Afghanistan again or use military force in Afghanistan ever again. And then you have the Washington, in its complete idiocy, citing this agreement as if it's still in effect and if the Taliban is our counterterrorism partner. Well, meanwhile, they're using it to defend one of the most wanted terrorists on the planet, right? Washington simultaneously has a $10 million reward, up to $10 million reward for Sergio Nakhani, whose dossier of Al-Qaeda ties and connections, that's even just a vast understatement, but be that as it may, his Al-Qaeda role is well documented, okay? From bin Laden's files, his own public statements, media, just it goes on and on and on. But the bottom line is that contrary to being our counterterrorism partner, or living up to their so-called counterterrorism assurances, the Taliban, under the Doha deal, the Taliban is using the Doha deal to protect the terrorists, Holy cow. How incompetent is this, right? And Washington just doesn't even register with them because they're out to lunch, right, Bill?
Yeah, Tom, I laugh because as soon as this thing was signed, I remember a phone call with you. And I remember you saying to me, man, they're going to use this as a cudgel against us. And I just remember shaking my head going, yeah, exactly. And it didn't take them long, but they've been using it since it's been signed. And it's completely unshocking to you and I. This document, a lot of people are trying to absolve the Trump administration and President Trump for his role in this. He wasn't president when this withdrawal was announced and executed. But he set the conditions for this debacle, and he shares blame in this problem, as do many others. Just as we can point to numerous problems of how we lost Afghanistan, we can point to numerous actors who were involved. President Trump shares a point of that, a part of that blame. Obviously, President Biden's execution of the withdrawal was horrific. I don't think it could be described as anything else. I mean, unless you think it was an extraordinary success, as he said, I think a lot of people would beg to differ on that. But yeah, this deal was a horrible idea. We said it for years. If you want to leave, leave. Do it in a manner that gives the Afghans the best chance to fight for their country. Help them on the way out the door. Pulling the rug, signing a bad deal and pulling the rug out was the worst possible way to leave Afghanistan. It's textbook. Like it couldn't have gone any better for the Taliban. Everything went in their favor. At every point, they got prisoners released. They got international recognition. They delegitimized the Afghan government, and the U.S. left in a manner that allowed them to conquer the country in 3.5 months.
Yeah, I mean, look, we don't need to go into all the deal problems again. You can go to previous podcasts and we talked about all this at the time, beforehand, during, and afterwards. We've talked about how this deal is ridiculous. But I just want to point out, and I'm going to write this up in a Long War Journal. Instead of living up to their counterterrorism commitments under the deal, which is the talking point from the State Department and others in Washington, the Taliban is using the deal to protect the terrorists, And I kind of want to add at the end of that, comma, you idiots, right? Because, it just shows how dumb this whole thing has been, right? I
Tom,
mean, just really,
I got to
really,
stop. Look, I think that's insulting to idiots and to all idiots out there. We at Generation Jihad apologize for equating you to the people that agreed to this deal and executed.
Unbelievable. Yeah, unbelievable. Anyway, so let's talk about some of the other Haqqani related stories here. One, obviously, Khalil Haqqani, who's Sir Juden's uncle, brother of Jalaluddin. He's been really feeling his oats here in the Taliban aftermath. He's been, having a victory tour across Afghanistan. He's been playing a big role diplomatically. He's the new minister of refugees in the Taliban regime. I think the Taliban is going to say he's protected as well by the Doha deal, even though he's a U.S. Designated terrorist and part of the designation was that he was working with Al-Qaeda very closely in their military operations and otherwise. And as Minister of Refugees, by the way, one of the things you and I heard, Bill, was that some of the Al-Qaeda guys in Afghanistan are considered refugees by the Taliban, right? Because they're refugees and so wait a minute now. So the guy, Khalil Haqqani, who's been working with Al-Qaeda for God knows how long, for decades, he's now the Minister of Refugees. I'm guessing part of that is that he's there to protect Al-Qaeda's refugees in Afghanistan. And the Taliban is going to say that he's not a legitimate counterterrorism target because of the Doha deal. Now, do you see how completely ridiculous this all is? Right? So literally the guy who would be in charge of protecting the Al-Qaeda refugees in Afghanistan is going to be defended by the Doha deal because they say you can't attack us in Afghanistan, including the guys that are protecting Al-Qaeda. Okay, this is, I don't even know. So let's go on. Another one. I've got another write-up coming on Ibrahim Haqqani as well. This is an interesting character too. He is Khalil's brother, so he's also a brother of Jalaluddin Haqqani. His full given name as in designations and sanctions and other places is Muhammad Ibrahim Omari. He's a well-known character. He was actually sanctioned in early 2001, so he's been sanctioned by the UN for more than 20 years. Presumably, he's protected by the Doha deal as well. Anyway, Ibrahim Haqqani, what's interesting, I noticed about this, and I'm going to write this up at the Long War Journal, is that he's identified, you remember, Bill, that in 2010, the Al-Qaeda negotiated this ransom exchange with the Afghan government for an Afghan ambassador, and they got $5 million for it. Well, he's identified in the bin Laden files as the key guarantor of the transaction. He's the key mediator, Ibrahim Haqqani is. So he's the guy who, in the bin Laden files, is identified as the key player here in making sure this money got into Al-Qaeda's coffers. And I guess, look, I think if the U.S. would say, hey, maybe we should be worried about Al-Qaeda's money man here, and Ibrahim Haqqani, the Taliban will say he's protected by the Doha deal as well. So this is, quite a fiasco. But I've got a piece coming up. You can see pictures of him online. He's feeling his oats as well. He's definitely having a victory parade. But again, all this speaks to the absurdity of the whole thing. And when I look online, it's just amazing how much the Haqqanis played a role in all this and how America never understood it. Never really synthesized it. Yes, at times the American government understood parts of it, but they never understood the whole story.
Yeah, they never had the full picture. I'll just highlight, and one of the fascinating things in looking at this new cabinet is they literally, I would say, I can't tell you what percentage because I haven't gone back in it, but nearly every one of these guys was involved in the Taliban's government back in 1996 to 2001. Some of them have the same exact roles that they had back then. But another Haqqani on this list, his name is Multaj Mir Jawad. He was the leader of what the U.S. military used to call the Kabul Attack Network. That's what pooled all the resources in the Kabul and the surrounding provinces from the Taliban. Obviously, Haqqanis are part of that. Al-Qaeda, Islamic Movement, Uzbekistan, Islamic Jihad using Turkestan Islamic Party, Hizbi Islamic Gulbuddin, etc., etc. All of the TTP movement in the Taliban in Pakistan. If they had resources in this area, they were the ones that pulled off these major attacks against hotels and U.S. installations and NGOs and schools. He's their first deputy of intelligence in the new Taliban government. He's a Haqqani network leader. The Haqqanis are integrated. He's not designated, but he is identified by the U.S. military and U.S. government as being a member.
But Bill, if he were designated, he'd still be protected by the.
He'd still be protected, so, right? He's actually even more protected because he's not a designated individual.
He's our counterterrorism partner now. I don't know what you're talking
about. Yeah, right. See, the intelligence. He's a guy. If we're working with the Taliban, to target Al Qaeda or the Islamic State, if you actually believe that nonsense, you'd be working with the guy who killed Americans and other civilians in horrific suicide assaults in Kabul for the last 15 plus years. Yeah, let's negotiate with the Taliban. Let's work with our new quote unquote Afghan partners. Thank you, General McKenzie.
Yeah, well, let's talk about his boss, who's the new acting director of intelligence. So this is a good segue here to 5 of my favorite guys in this whole story.
Yeah, I was saving them for you, Tom. I didn't want to steal your thunder.
No, it's all right. So his boss, Jawad's boss, in the new Taliban regime, which is really just the old Taliban regime, which apparently was just waiting to come back into power. Apparently for 20 years, apparently.
People, like when I say that these guys are taking the same jobs.
Oh, it's unbelievable.
It's incredible. It's literally, they just said, hey, you got your job back. And they probably had the same or similar job while the Taliban had their shadow government. Some of these guys went from like Minister of Mines and Petroleum to the Minister of Agriculture. But the real heavy hitters, the ones who mattered, get the defense, interior, things like that, intelligence, those guys got their jobs back.
Let's just briefly go into the 5 guys we're talking about here. These are 5 ex-Gitmo detainees. They were held at Guantanamo. They were traded or exchanged for Bo Bergdahl, an American soldier who deserted his post in 2014. Bergdahl was then held by the Haqqanis, of course, because they just magically appear at all the key junctures here. And so these 5 Guantanamo detainees were exchanged for him in 2014. Now, remember, part of when we talk about the ambivalence here in the war in Afghanistan is that, remember, in 2014, it was that same year, this was all part of the Obama administration's attempt to wrap up the war. So it was by the end of the year, President Obama announced the end of combat operations by the U.S. and NATO. So this exchange was all supposed to be part about bringing the last of the Americans held by the Taliban and Haqqanis home because the U.S. was supposedly getting out in 2014. That's how long the political establishment has really... This even predates that, but that's how long the political establishment has been looking to run from this. So anyway, the 5 guys include Abdul Haq Wasik. Abdul Haq Wasik is one of these ex-Gitmo detainees. He was a senior intelligence figure. He was a deputy minister of security intelligence during the Taliban's first regime. Bill, you said that some of these guys got their old jobs back. Well, Wasik got a promotion.
He got a promotion, yeah.
From Islamic Emirate 1.0 to 2.0, he's actually now just the director of intelligence. So he was deputy director, now he's director. So good for him. Now, what did he do his first time around? Well, the first time around, and you can find this, we linked to the UN sanctions page because he's been sanctioned for more than 20 years, since early 2001. And you could see in early 2001, the UN said that he went from being a local commander in Nimruz and Kandahar provinces to being the deputy director general of intelligence. And it was in that role, according to the UN, he was in charge of handling relations with al-Qaeda-related foreign fighters and their training camps in Afghanistan. So here's a guy who's the new director of intelligence for the Taliban's Islamic Emirate 2.0, who literally helped al-Qaeda with its camps and its facilitation network pre-9/11. Good going. And I'm guessing he's protected by the Doha deal too, Bill. Right? I mean, he's got to be. I mean,
Sure is.
I'm
He's also a Gitmo guy, Tom, and those guys. They're untouchable now. You can't touch them. That would just be horrible.
He's one of the 5 ex-Gitmo detainees that we have a write up here about these guys are new leaders. Another one is Mohammed Fazl, who was a deputy defense minister pre 9/11. He's deputy defense minister again. He was an ex-Gitmo detainee exchanged for Bergdahl. Good going. Fazl, there's all sorts of evidence that he worked with Al Qaeda prior to 9/11. Go figure. In fact, it was after one of the things that stuck out to me in all the files that come out about him is that after Al Qaeda killed Ahmed Shah Massoud on September 9th, 2001, Fazl coordinated with Abdul Hadi al-Iraqi, who was a top lieutenant for bin Laden, to launch the offensive against the Northern Alliance to try and knock them out as in preparation for the aftermath of 9/11. Now, whether he knew about 9/11 or not, I don't know, but the bottom line is he was part of Al Qaeda had a synchronized game plan for 9/11 that involved a military component on the ground in Afghanistan. This guy was part of it, and he's back in charge of Deputy Minister of Defense there. But you have 3 others. You have Karula Kerkwa. He was all these 4 of the 5 guys here were sanctioned. This is what's so ridiculous about this. 4 of the 5 guys here were sanctioned in January or February of 2001 by the UN.
Before 9/11.
These guys were known bad actors all the way back then. In fact, I think something like 17 out of the 33 named ministers for the Taliban's new regime were sanctioned by the UN. Most, if not all of them, prior to 9/11. So it's literally just the old regime. These guys were waiting. They were either captured and let go, or in Pakistan or Qatar or whatever, just, biding their time to basically take over once again. That, again, speaks to the absurdity of all this. But Karula Kerkwa, he was the top confidant of Mullah Omar prior to 9/11. He was also the governor of the Herat province and held other senior positions. Well, one of the things he did, and this was held up by a D.C. district court, is he brokered the deal with the Iranian government to work together against America after America invaded Afghanistan in late 2001. Wow. So that's something he admitted to many times in the district court in denying his petition for habeas corpus. That's something that the court noted was accurate. So, by the way, these 2 other guys real quick, and I'll make another point. Nurullah Nori, he's got a pretty menacing picture. You can see it Long War Journal. He's got a glare. He's now the acting minister of borders and tribal affairs. Interesting. He was a top military commander for the Taliban pre 9/11. According to the information that Joint Task Force Guantanamo, which oversaw the detention facility, he's somebody who fought alongside Al Qaeda as a Taliban military general against the Northern Alliance prior to 9/11 and hosted Al Qaeda commanders. And both he and Fazl are actually suspected of committing war crimes in pre 9/11 Afghanistan. And then the final one is Mohammed Nabi Omari, who he's not a named cabinet minister in the Taliban's regime, but he's now the governor in the Khost province. He was a close associate of Jalaluddin Haqqani. He's somebody who worked as part of this joint Al Qaeda Taliban cell, according to the intelligence cited by JTF Gitmo. And his son, I remember you noted this on Twitter, Bill, that his son Abdul Haq was actually killed during fighting in Khost in July. And of course, the Taliban openly celebrated on Voice of Jihad, celebrated his son's martyrdom. So these are 5 guys who were Gitmo detainees, who were traded for a deserter in Bo Bergdahl, and they have assumed either the same role or a similar role or just a slightly different role now in the Taliban's Islamic Emirate 2.0. And, oh, by the way, there's no evidence, there's no reason to think any one of the 5 was innocent when they were held at Guantanamo. None. I don't know of any evidence that they were tortured, by the way. I know a lot of people like to say that all the Gitmo detainees were innocent and tortured. I don't think that's true in most cases. But in any event, there's no evidence these guys were tortured or that they were innocent. And all 5 of them, there's intelligence, including either from the UN sanctions pages or from JTF Gitmo or other sources. There's evidence all 5 of them worked with Al Qaeda prior to 9/11, and they're right back in the game.
Yeah, the thing that struck me, Tom, when we were going through these, and we're going to go back to, sorry to take it back to why we lost, but look at this list. Did we defeat the Taliban after the invasion in 2001, 2002? The Taliban's leadership is the same leadership. It's only slight differences here. Forget Mullah Yaqub, Mullah Omar's son, right? Well, he was a jihadist 20 years ago. Sirajuddin Haqqani, the same thing. They weren't in top leadership posts within the Taliban. They certainly were well positioned for it. So they're just they're old blood, just new old blood. But the guys that you're mentioning here, the Taliban leadership fled to Pakistan. and Iran and other places. They held out, they waited us out, and then waited for the military victory, and now they're back. This is an indictment on across 4 administrations and failure to deal with Pakistan as the Taliban's prime supporter, prime ally. The fact, people say, "Oh, there's no military solution to Afghanistan." Well, guess what? I could have given you a non-military solution to Afghanistan. Put the pressure on the Pakistanis. We could have designated individuals and worked your way up all the way to cutting off trade and stopping travel. And remember, a lot of Pakistanis are dual citizens or have money invested in Britain and France and European countries or United States. All the way. And then on the other side, what if you started arming India, giving it its advanced technology and insisted that it put it on the border with Pakistan? Look, I can't build a time machine and tell you that this would have worked, but I'm pretty damn sure if you would have went down this path, that all of these guys on this list would have been dead on the streets of Miranshah, Peshawar, Rawalpindi, Islamabad, Quetta, and everywhere else. But we just decided that we were going to pretend that Pakistan was our friend here and that Pakistan wasn't really supporting the Taliban. The fact that these individuals are still alive today and that they've come back to lead the Taliban once again is an indication that, yes, we drove the Taliban off the battlefield by 2002. They were defeated on the battlefield, but they did not suffer a strategic defeat. That strategic defeat would have been taking out their leaders, taking out their religious leaders who were very important to the organization. But as you can see right here, some individuals died, but not enough of them, not the senior ones, not the ones that counted.
Yeah, I know when you and I were looking through the list of the cabinet ministers in particular for the Taliban, Islamic Emirate, we were just struck by how much of these guys are old personalities. I mean, the head of state, so-called head of state, and sometimes they call him prime minister, which is a joke because this is not some European style, government here. Give me a break. But it shows how these guys, bad actors around the globe, are able to ape sort of the language used or mimic the language used by the U.S. and European countries to describe their governments because, whatever. But the guy is Hassan Akhund. And one of the things I found in going through, I remember it actually from years ago, is that Akhund very loudly after the U.S. embassy bombings in 1998, which was Al-Qaeda's the most deadly attacks carried out by Al-Qaeda prior to 9/11, Akhund in 1999, when the UN said, turn over bin Laden or you face sanctions to the Taliban, Akhund was the guy who came out and said, no, we're not going to turn over Osama at any price. Doesn't matter what you want. He's now the head of state, so-called head of state for the Taliban's regime. I mean, that guy has been in the game forever, and he's just back. In fact, he just got a promotion, really. I mean, he was foreign minister. He held these other positions in the Taliban's first regime, and now he's back. So, look, I think this is part of the reason why we're recording this. We're going to wrap up here because there's a lot of other things to do, and we'll come back. We'll try and record the next episode in short order, not have as much of a delay. But part of the reason why we're recording this with as much sort of anger but mixed with humor here after the fall of Afghanistan is because, years from now, people are going to try and figure out what went wrong. And I just want to say to those people speaking throughout, the history here, if you're listening to this sometime in the distant future, it's worse than whatever you think it was, right? It's much worse, right? If you think this was incompetent and there was corruption and there was stupidity and there was all these things and a lack of leadership and poor leadership and Taliban apology and all these things, all that's true. Just, it really could not have been I don't know how it could have been handled any worse, right? This is about as poorly handled as possible, I would say, from top to bottom. That isn't to say there weren't some successes. There were, of course. I mean, they got bin Laden. They took out some Al-Qaeda guys here and there. They did this and that. Great. But none of that really justifies the overall, and they stopped plots, of course, coming out of the region. Absolutely, that happened. That's a big deal against the U.S. and our allies. But the cost here, the incompetence, the problems with this war don't justify all that, right? I mean, to my mind, when I look at all the costs here of how this was waged and how ridiculous this whole spectacle has been, this debacle has been, I just hope that people in the future realize that this was really just a colossal failure of American leadership, colossal, from both parties, and that nobody knew what they were doing. The truth of the matter is the emperor was nude all along.
Yeah, Tom, that's absolutely right. We had tactical wins, as you know, killing bin Laden, killing senior Al Qaeda leaders. By the way, how did we do that? With a presence in Afghanistan. But it was just an overall strategic failure. For Al Qaeda operates in more regions in the world, more countries. You have a rival in the Islamic State, which is equally as deadly. They both share the same goals, and no one understands this. And this is 9/11, right? We were recording on September 10th here, and if look, some of our listeners, you may not have been born, or you may have been very young when that happened. Go back and watch it. There's a documentary on Netflix that I'm reticent to recommend, but watch the first episode and a half of that and get the visuals of it and see what happened to your American citizens. And remember, and what bothers me maybe the most about all of this, I hate losing, I hate failure, I hate incompetence, I hate watching our political leaders just fall all over themselves, groveling to the Taliban. But and maybe it's that part that bothers me the most. These are our enemies who just go back and look at what happened on 9/11 and remember that they don't have any anger and any frustration. And some of the theme of that show is, well, we acted out of anger and whatever. Look, I'm going to tell you, a healthy dose of anger isn't a bad thing. Holding on to that anger isn't a bad thing. You need to remember what they've done to us as a country, what they've done to 3,000 of your fellow countrymen and thousands of American soldiers and civilians since then. They are our enemies. And this idea that they're not, and not just that, but then groveling to them in the process, this deal, it's I don't have words for it. I'm frustrated and angry, but most of all, probably disgusted by our political leadership and even our generals who should know better, who should understand this threat. And when they use words like calling the Taliban our Afghan partners, I know I've referenced that probably 2-3 times during this episode, but that one will stick to me to my grave.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just close on this thought. I mean, that's the point in all this is like, yeah, this war was messed up and was a debacle from top to bottom in a lot of ways. Although, again, there's some tactical successes, but overall it was a mess. The thing I would say about it is that none of that leads me to make excuses for the Taliban. And it's just pathetic to watch how many people in the so-called American elite fall over themselves to make excuses for the Taliban and entertain these ridiculous counterfactuals in which the Taliban, was something other than the Taliban and something other than Al-Qaeda's closest ally. It's just pathetic, And we've cited many times Mullah Omar on September 26, 2001, defiantly saying that he wasn't going to turn over bin Laden, and this was a matter for Islam's prestige. And yet people falling over themselves to find articles in the weeks that followed saying, oh no, the Taliban was willing to negotiate bin Laden's status. No, they weren't. That was all interference, it's all obfuscation. They still claim to this day. They claimed then that there was no evidence of bin Laden's involvement, and they wanted to be presented with evidence. That was the key thing that they kept saying over and over again in late 2001. These other figures, not Mullah Omar. They still say that to this day. 20 years later, the Taliban says there's no evidence. This Taliban spokesman just said this recently. There's no evidence that bin Laden or Al-Qaeda was responsible for 9/11, and yet you have Washington falling over itself to entertain counterfactuals that absolve the Taliban. Pathetic, absolutely pathetic, And so, yeah, that doesn't. I'm not saying that everything that went wrong in this war is justified because of that. It isn't. But this counterfactual that you see entertained all over the place is really perverse. It's really sick stuff. And there's just a mountain of facts that show that these people don't know what they're talking about. But it shows you the desire, the willingness to whitewash this stuff. And so 20 years after 9/11, I think America lost something other than just the war in Afghanistan. I think it lost its sense of its own self. And the fact that our so-called elites are so willing to defend the Taliban, well, it's your Emirate too now then. If you're one of these people who makes excuses for the Taliban, it's your Emirate too. And you should take a point of pride that you helped resurrect this regime because now it's back in power. Bill, you have anything to close?
No, Tom, that's absolutely right. I also wish they could be forced to live there for a couple of years, bring your families, enjoy your new Emirate. All these people kvetching over, I can't believe the Taliban's beating women and journalists and whatnot. Really? You can't believe it? I mean, it's the same leadership from 1996 to 2001. We knew this was going to happen. And, you apologists who led to this, go buy a villa in Kabul and get back to me in 5 years.
On that cheery note, that's episode 56 of Generation Jihad. Thank you to our audience for listening. Please do subscribe to the show. As a reminder, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Hopefully that if you're listening to this episode or any episode really, you got something, you're working out, lifting weights, doing something to get angry and sort of take it out. That's certainly what I'm going to do after this. And we will see you again soon. This has been 3 weeks in between episode 55 and 56. It won't be that long to hear from us again. Take care.